father, right? Is his name J. Marshall? Where is that? Do you remember what his name was? Where is this? Mr. Justice. Robert Marshall. At a dinner with Lewis Marshall's son, Robert, who was then working for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and one of the justice's favorite visitors, Cardozo confided he hated being a Supreme Court justice. By the way, Benjamin Cardozo disliked being a Supreme Court justice, and we'll get to why that is. But this is just showing the very interesting connection. For those of you who weren't here last week, I talked about Lewis Marshall and Louis Brandeis. And Louis Marshall was the person who many people believed would be the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And but he was not selected for a variety of reasons. It's kind of just luck. When the right opening at the right time, it was a Democrat who was president, Woodrow Wilson, and he chose Brandeis. Had it been a different president, he might have chose Louis Marshall. Just, but Louis Marshall and Louis Brandeis were probably two of the most outstanding lawyers in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, born the same year, very different. Louis Marshall was very much more involved in the Jewish community than Louis Brandeis. He was president of a synagogue, went to services. Brandeis was not at all. Louis Marshall was more, he was a Republican, although he was in the sort of tradition of free markets, whereas Brandeis was very hard to classify. He was a progressive, but he was also a major free trader. So he didn't fit into a lot of categories. But in any case, the reason I bring that up with Gail is Gail is related to Louis Marshall. Louis Marshall's family has essentially stayed consistent, whereas Brandeis' family has kind of gone all over the place. But Louis Marshall's family is intact, and it's quite a wonderful history. I mean, really, if you were to list the most sort of influential American Jews of the 20th century, Louis Marshall would certainly be on it. He's not studied as much as others, perhaps because sort of he sort of represented that era of the behind the scenes, influential, sort of a kind of advocacy for Jews that doesn't really exist anymore. Sort of very the German Jewish patrician model. Whereas that has faded away. It's much more about politics and money and this and that now. I mean, not that money wasn't important back then, but it was a different kind of influence. Anyways, that's a sidetrack. The person, Marilyn, go ahead, sure. Yeah, unmute, we can't hear you.
John Marshall, he was the longest serving Chief Justice in the Supreme Court.
Yes, different family.
Different Marshall?
No, Louis Marshall was a lawyer, Jewish lawyer, whose parents had immigrated from Germany. John Marshall was, the classic Supreme Court. I mean, he was the first Chief Justice, but different family.
Right. But going back to John Marshall, he served the longest of all the Supreme Court judges, and he was influential in making the distinction of the Supreme Court, the three branches of the government.
Yes.
So he's a very
John Marshall Law School here in Chicago. No longer John Marshall, though. It's UIC. They merged with UIC. My sister works there. My sister has worked there like 25 years. She's like part-time in their career placement office, and they merged with UIC, which is good for them, actually. It's a very
so Evan, if you really want to be on the in with the Marshall family, you should know that they call Louis Marshall Louis.
Is that right?
Yes, my son-in-law corrected me. We always called him Louis.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
That's how he was.
He seems, just reading the description, that he was a very formal kind of very, your classic German Jewish kind of, everything in its place. Probably wore a jacket and tie when he was at home. Is that how your son-in-law grew up, or did they change over the years?
He did not, but he would go to see his grandfather. We had a place in New Hope, and they wore jackets and ties to dinner. Out in New Hope, Pennsylvania. It's
right.
That's the way it was.
Different era.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And they had a place on Saranac Lake, where they would go.
Yeah.
all the families would gather, and it was very much the German Jewish intelligentsia, and yes.
Yes, quite. It was an amazing group of people. I mean, just
Yes.
immensely bright, successful, philanthropic,
Yes.
intellectual. But the group today. So today we're going to talk about Justice Benjamin Cardozo, who was the second Jewish Supreme Court justice. Now, Cardozo sadly, he died early. He was only on the court for 9 years. And yet he's still considered an outstanding justice. Probably would have been more outstanding had he lived longer, but he got sick. But he was already an extremely respected jurist when he was appointed. He had been chief judge of the New York Supreme Court for 18 years and was kind of, universally applauded. Interestingly, he was appointed by, I believe it was Herbert Hoover. Was it Hoover? Yeah. It was Herbert Hoover, and Cardozo was a Democrat, and Hoover was a Republican, which is interesting. But he was so, again, Supreme Court hearings weren't as contentious back then, but he was universally seen as the best pick. Kind of like the most respected, intelligent, learned judge. And so Herbert Hoover chose him. But before we go back to who, so their American Jewish history can kind of be divided. I want to give you the history because Cardozo comes from kind of one of the elitist of the elite families of American Jewry. So what do I mean by that? So there are kind of 3 phases of American Jewish history. We common Jews, most of us come from the immigrants who came to Europe or came from Europe between 1881 and 1920. That was the vast, probably 90% of American Jews trace their lineage to that group. These were people who came from Poland and Russia and Lithuania, some from Germany, even Central Eastern Germany. Most American Jews can trace their lineage back to this period. That's, most of us. Then there's a group that came probably 30 to 40 years before that. Those are the German Jews. Those were about, and there weren't that many of them. There were only about 40 to 50,000 initially. A few trickled in after that. But these were the Guggenheims, the Seligmans, the Macy's people, the Strausses. In Chicago, these were the people that, founded Sinai Temple and KAM, these grand synagogues that were founded in the 1850s. These Lehmans, Loeb, Leopold and Loeb, so this group immigrated from Germany in the 1840s and 1850s. They were mostly middle class in Germany. So they were already somewhat established. Most of our ancestors, 1881, they were poor. They may have been farmers, peddlers, they may probably, enough to make a living, but they were mostly poor. The people who immigrated from Germany in the 1840s, 1850s were kind of established liberal intelligentsia. Most of them were not that religious already. They may have had some orthodoxy. This is where Lewis Marshall we were talking about. This is where Brandeis's family, 1856, they come to Louisville, Kentucky. His father's a successful grain trader. So this group is sort of what we often think of as the American Jewish elite. Now, it doesn't, in Chicago, we have the Standard Club and the Covenant Club. They're now one, but this is the Standard Club group. But even before that, there was the Sephardic Jews. And the Sephardic Jews first come to America in 1654. And 1655 is when even more come. But the Sephardic Jews are like the original aristocracy of American Jews. Now, the reason we don't talk about them that much is they were very small. And most of them aren't Jewish anymore. Most of them assimilated totally. Now, there's some who are still, but most of them, because they were such a small group, they either assimilated into the Christian mainstream or died off or married, Eastern European or German Jews. So there's a very small group today. And many of them who are worship in Sephardic synagogues today are not of that early ilk, the ones who came before 1840. But there were families who came during that period. And they had last names like Nathan, Saxis, Mendez, Gomez. So you can hear the Spanish Portuguese influence, and most of them were merchants and traders. Many of them, one of them helped found the New York Stock Exchange. One of them financed the Revolutionary War, Chaim Solomon. So these were, several of them were really the kind of the foundation of America. Now, who were they? Well, many of them could trace their lineage back to Spain in the 10th and 11th centuries, the golden age of Spain, even the 12th century, one could say. So these were, at that period, Jews attained enormous success politically, financially, culturally across Spain. And they were, quite just illustrious poets, professors, translators, writers, financiers. They had castles. I mean, they were, which was a very successful group. And then we kind of know what happened. First, you have, Muslim invasions, the Almohads, which drove some Jews out, because most of these Jews who established success, they were under moderate Muslim rule. And then there was extreme Muslim rule, and that drove some out. But then you have the Inquisition, which really starts in the 14th century. And what happens during the Inquisition is many families are forced to leave. They go into exile, and then they kind of drop off the radar screen. So some go to Portugal, some go to Amsterdam, some go to other parts of Europe, some go to Israel, Palestine, and then a whole bunch convert. Now, some convert for real, and they are now Catholic. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the great Catholic mystics of the 15th and 16th centuries, John of the Cross, who wrote a very, very important book called Dark Night of the Soul. He was Marrano, his grandparents were Jewish. Teresa of Avila, one of the most important Catholic saints, still very much respected today. She was a Marrano. Some of the early Jesuits. So some of them converted for real, but a lot converted publicly, but remained Jewish privately. So for example, the Mendez family, they're very prominent in Spain in the 1300s. And then suddenly they drop off the map. There's nothing in their genealogy or anything until suddenly in the 1700s, they pop up again in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam was a place where many conversos, or Marrano Jews ended up going and then reclaiming their Judaism, essentially, because in Amsterdam was free. Amsterdam was a trading, a real sort of merchant-centered capitalist island, and Jews were pretty much free to do anything they wanted in Amsterdam. So this group then, ultimately, a lot of them are just merchant traders, and they're on ships, and some of them end up going to the New World, where they're bringing in goods. Some of them establish mines, copper mines. They're fur traders. They're the kind of professions that really were the very early days of America. And a few of them were Sephardic Jews. Now, how did they survive? Essentially, part of it was when one came over, a lot came over. Another thing is they married each other. They all married each other. So Benjamin Cardozo's parents were cousins. This was sort of the norm. And they which just had very tight families, and they all worshiped at the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. So if you've ever, I'm sure you've all been to New York. If you, next time you go, if you haven't yet, go to Sherith Israel Congregation, the Spanish Portuguese synagogue. It is incredible. So, I mean, it's just beautiful, the style. Now, interestingly, this tells you a lot about where we are historically. The current rabbi of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue is Ashkenazic. He's the first in their history. And they were, this goes back, the synagogue was closed during the Revolutionary War because its rabbi, who was a great uncle of Cardozo, was pro-American revolutionaries, and he moved the synagogue to Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. So this group then, so just to kind of put it in context, this group were a very intellectual, disciplined, small, tight-knit group of Jews, most of whom worked in finance and law and trade and business. And Cardozo, Benjamin Cardozo, comes from that milieu, very much so. You know, he's born, he is part of, he remained a member of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue his entire life, even though he wasn't observant. He was observant up until his bar mitzvah. He grew up in an observant kosher household. But this is the context in which he grows up, and very different than Louis Brandeis. And he and Louis Brandeis served on the Supreme Court at the same time so Brandeis is appointed in 1916. Cardozo is appointed in 1932. Cardozo dies in 1940 or 1939. So they're on the court together for 7 years. They don't really like each other. They're so different, and yet they're similar in philosophy, both very liberal. They join together in a lot of sense, but they're so different. Cardozo was sort of he had Jewishness built into him, but it was a certain kind of Jewishness. Brandeis was more of a political progressive, just a different milieu, different way of life. So a little bit of history of Cardozo. So Cardozo's father was also a lawyer and also a judge on the New York Supreme Court. However, he was one of 3 justices caught up in a horrible scandal where, I mean, you've probably heard of Tammany Hall. So Tammany Hall was the Democratic kind of, political mafia that ran New York, sort of New York's early version of the Daily Machine, but even more corrupt. And it ran, this guy ran out of this hall, I think his name was Sweeney, and he would essentially dole out all the political patronage jobs in New York City. That was how it worked, and including judgeships. And one of the people that he got appointed was Cardozo's father, let's see if I'll find his name. But anyways, Cardozo's father ends up with a political appointment on the New York Supreme Court. He's respected as a judge. He's no dummy. He's not unqualified. But then what happens is he gets in trouble because he is appointed, when there would be a foreclosure, there would be people who would oversee the foreclosure, and that was a paid job. And Judge Cardozo would give all these patronage jobs to whoever Tammany Hall told him to give it to. And he would hire people for the Supreme Court who he was told to hire. And there was a huge controversy, and he and 2 other judges were wrapped up in it, and he resigned. The other 2 were actually impeached, essentially, but he chose to resign. He kept his law license, which was lucky. He had enough. Tammany Hall was exposed, but it still remained. So he still had enough influence that he was able to keep his law license. And he went back to private law practice and was, he wasn't as successful as he once was. Benjamin Cardozo grew up in a beautiful brownstone house on, one of the nice streets. They didn't live there anymore, but his father made a decent living as a lawyer. Benjamin Cardozo grows up. He's privately tutored. He doesn't go to school. He's privately tutored at home by none other than Horatio Alger. You've all heard of Horatio Alger, the stories about, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. I hate to burst anyone's bubble. This is a sad. Alger was also a pedophile, unfortunately. I hate to tell you. Look it up. Google Horatio. He was a Unitarian minister who was kicked out of his church because young boys complained. And, this was the 1860s, so there wasn't an internet and people didn't get in trouble, and he was able to have a career. But it's sort of a sad story. I found that out while researching this. Anyways, be that as it may. The reason that actually might have some relevance later, but we'll get to that. But Cardozo is tutored, and he's very bright. He starts Columbia University at age 15, and graduates at the very top of his class. So obviously very bright lawyer. And then he goes to law school, and is immediately sort of a respected lawyer. He argues the most cases before the New York Appeals Court. Other lawyers, he's one of those lawyers, and I understand there are lawyers like this still today, who are sort of considered very elite lawyers who, they handle the appeals. So if a case is appealed to a U.S. appeals court or the Supreme Court, the lawyer who is representing whoever's made the appeal, they will bring on another lawyer who specializes in these appeals. And Cardozo was one of those lawyers. So he was sort of a lawyer's lawyer. And he's highly respected, successful, eventually is appointed to the state Supreme Court. And then he's in New York, there's like a court above the state Supreme Court. I forget what it's called, but he's appointed to the highest court in New York State, and then ultimately becomes the chief judge of that court. Now, in a sense, if you want to look at it from a psychological perspective, he is in some ways repairing his family name. His father was disgraced, and his father's last name was Cardozo. And he, by achieving this great success, is kind of restoring some credibility and honor to that name. Now, in his personal life, this is very interesting. Cardozo never married. So he's a bachelor his whole life. Was he gay? Perhaps. It's hard to say. Nobody knows. He has all his papers burned when he dies. So that's kind of interesting. So he's very, very few records remain of his, unlike Brandeis, unlike others who have tons of records remain. For the early part of his life, he lived and took care of his sister. He was very close with his sister. She cared for him, he cared for her. And he was also kind of enmeshed in the New York Sephardic social scene. He was sort of a kind of member of this establishment, who would go to clubs, go to the country for the summer, eat out. He was friendly. He socialized with all sort of the New York Jewish elite, and all of this. So that was his life, but he was also just extremely dedicated to the law. He wrote out all his opinions by longhand, and he did all the research, which was different than most judges at that level. Most of the work is done by the clerks, the Supreme Court, even Louis Brandeis, a lot of the initial drafts of opinions, the research was done by clerks. Cardozo had clerks, but he barely used them. He did most of the work himself. So it sounds like he was a bit of a workaholic, but highly respected and a beautiful writer. I read a little bit of his legal writing. Most of it's not, I don't understand it that well because it's legal, nature, but his style is quite elegant. I mean, he just had a beautiful way of writing. So he was a very disciplined, respected lawyer and judge. Yeah, Marilyn, go ahead.
Yeah. His father's name was Alfred
Cardozo. Yeah.
And his sister was a twin.
Yeah.
And she was the only one of all the children. There were 6 children and the rest were boys, and none of them married. She was the only one who married, and she had no children. So there is no lineage here.
Yeah, yeah.
No
It's very
adopted
interesting.
children, no lineage.
Yeah.
So, and then I was wondering, you were saying the highest court, could that not have been the Court of Appeals?
Yeah, I think it's called the Court of Appeals. So that's above the New York Supreme Court, just in
Or
terminology.
Court of Appeals. He
Yeah.
was the jurist on the New York
Yeah.
Court of Appeals, probably.
It is very, he has no, there aren't any heirs, but there are still a lot of Cardozos because there were other Cardozos. There was a very famous rabbi who's up there, and they're all related. There's, you can assume they're related to each other because these families all intermarried, intermingled. So there's Cardozo Law School, which is named after Benjamin Cardozo. But there was another very famous rabbi named Nathan Lopez Cardozo, who was a relative. So all these families are connected. So there are still Cardozos, just not of that line, which is kind of sad, but it is what it is. It's just
Evan,
yeah.
just to avoid confusion, the New York Supreme Court
Yeah.
is the equivalent of the district courts in the other states.
Ah,
The lowest court. And the Court of Appeals is the equivalent of the Supreme Court.
okay, excellent. Thank you, Bob. So Cardozo and his father were both judges on the New York Court of Appeals, whereas not the Supreme Court of New York. And then Benjamin Cardozo was the chief judge, and respected at that. And there have been several Jewish chief judges of the New York Court of Appeals. Cardozo also becomes a trustee of Columbia University. And it was at Columbia University had a Jewish trustee before, but not for 130 years. 130 years before Cardozo, it was his great uncle, Gershom Saxes, who was the rabbi of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. So his relative was the first Jewish trustee, and then 130 years later, Cardozo becomes the second Jewish trustee. And by the way, he's a trustee while there's a pretty much standard anti-Semitic president, the president Nicholas Butler. There were quotas on Jews. There was, all the Ivy League universities had quotas on Jews at the time. I don't know if Penn did. I'm not sure Penn did, but Columbia did, Harvard did, Yale did, Princeton certainly did. Now we know Stanford did too in the 50s. It's interesting, but that was a whole big news article a couple of weeks ago. Stanford University, their archives found they limited the number of Jewish students who were admitted in the 1950s, which is interesting because one of our past presidents at Legacy Solel, who's since deceased, sadly, Arthur Siegel, graduated from Stanford in the 50s. So somehow he got in, which speaks to his intelligence. Anyways, this was a different, Cardozo really, in his writings, he really didn't experience much anti-Semitism. In some ways, maybe his circle was so small, and the Sephardic Jews, it's interesting. The Sephardic Jews they probably experienced anti-Semitism, but there's not much written about their experience of anti-Semitism. Maybe they didn't like to talk about it. Maybe they just kind of saw themselves as, their self-image was as elites. I mean, there was in one of the books I was reading about this, there were Sephardic Jews in the 1700s and 1800s, even going to the 20th century. They looked down on the people who came on the Mayflower. They're like, all those people who came on the Mayflower, they were poor in Britain. They were the lower class of Britain who came here. We were already enormously successful in Spain. So they saw themselves as a very elitist group, which is interesting. And maybe some deserved it. Obviously, they're very smart, but it was a different ethic, a different way of being in the world than most Jews throughout history. Yeah. Go ahead, Marilyn.
The importance of Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur for these Jews who had to either die or give up their religions. And as you say, some did, and some did underground and kept their books and their studies. But Kol Nidre was such an important, asking God to forgive them for having to make these decisions. And so whenever I stand at that moment, I think about this generation and how important that service is for so many reasons.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Kol Nidre was an evening when, we specifically say those all sinners are welcome. And that there are scholars who believe that is a veiled reference to these Jews who converted to Christianity, but remain Jewish in secret. And there were a lot. Scholars estimate that about 1/3 of Spanish Jewry converted to Catholicism. And what's so interesting is they converted to Catholicism, but they still basically associated with other people just like them. There were neighborhoods in the city that were known as the Converso neighborhoods. This is where the Jews who converted to Catholicism live. This is their country club. It's just, it was they stuck together. Now, some of them, as we know, really become Catholic, but many continue to practice Judaism in secret. And we don't know how many did. It's very hard to say because unsurprisingly, there aren't many genealogical records because they were trying to stay under the radar. You would understand that. So that as I was saying, all these families had basically big empty portions where there's very little record of them being alive, and then suddenly they pop up again in genealogies in the 1700s because then they're free to go back. They're in a different place. So this period of time was just very ambiguous for Jews. I mean, this was a very, starting in 1492 up until about 1700, 1600s, there's some progress, but that is you wouldn't want to be Jewish during that point in time because it was very hard. There was really no place Jews could live openly except really Eastern Europe. You couldn't be open in Spain. England banishes Jews, France banishes Jews, Germany, you have some Jewish communities in Germany, but then you have Lutheranism, so that's not good. So this is why many of our ancestors ended up in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, parts of Germany and parts of Southern France too, but not that many. And so this was a very dark period. And then over time, it opens up, and this Sephardic group, a number of them make their way to America. Some of them even, it's very interesting. You ever watch this? This came out about 15 years ago, and I'm sure some of you watched it then, and I certainly did, was when PBS did that series called The Jewish Americans. Must have been 2006, 2007. They had a whole thing about the Sephardic Jews, many of whom ended up going west, during the gold rush. There was a whole group of Sephardic Jews that moved out, that went to California. Many, there were communities where there was just, one Jewish family. So this was quite a remarkable group. Okay, other questions so far? So let me talk a little bit about Cardoza's. Yeah, Sue, go ahead.
So when you talk about the Sephardic Jews not experiencing so much anti-Semitism, is it possible because their last names were not typically Jewish?
Very possible. Very possible.
I think people that have typically Jewish last names give away. I mean, even those who have those kind of names and aren't Jewish sometimes are faced with anti-Semitism. It's the name that gives it away.
I think that's part of it, but I also think in some ways it's because there weren't that many of them. So one, two, America was just smaller back then. So it's kind of like everyone needed each other. Everyone was kind of working together. Nobody really cared. I mean, there were the certain families, the Livingstons, these sort of New York, the Roosevelt, these sort of elite families like that. But America was still sort of a backwater, and so everyone just kind of got along. And it wasn't until a lot of Jews immigrated in vast numbers that you see an increase in anti-Semitism. So part of it is just a function of America being a different place back then. And yes, you're right about the last names. It's just so interesting. I remember seeing this when I was in Amsterdam, because there's a beautiful Sephardic synagogue in Amsterdam. And, they have a Yortzeit wall, just like modern synagogues today and all the last names are Spanish-speaking last names or Spanish-sounding last names. By the way, I forgot. I didn't write this down. I'm glad I remembered now. When Sonia Sotomayor was appointed a Supreme Court justice by President Obama, she was lauded in the news as the first Hispanic Supreme Court justice. There were several articles in the Wall Street Journal that said, actually, no, Justice Cardozo should be considered a Hispanic Supreme Court justice because of that Sephardic going back to Spain and Portugal. There were others who argued, no, that's not really. Portugal is different than Spain, and his family goes back to Portugal, not Spain. So, it wasn't universally accepted, but that was certainly a question that why isn't that part of his heritage honored? So you look at there was the piece that I read was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about that. Now, in the grand scheme of things, who really cares? But it's just an interesting vignette about his lineage. Okay, so Cardozo's appointed to the Supreme Court. Now, his appointment was unusual in that, as I mentioned, Herbert Hoover is a Republican. Cardozo is a Democrat, and a fairly progressive Democrat. Now, he's not a political activist like Brandeis was. Brandeis was a active political progressive. Cardozo is a judge, so he's not. But Cardozo has enormous support from across the political spectrum, which is interesting. Brandeis's appointment was so controversial. Cardozo's is not. His biggest champion was a senator from Idaho. And there was some opposition, mainly because when he was appointed, there were 2 Jewish Supreme Court justices now, 2 out of 9 for a small group. The biggest anti-Semite on the court is Judge James McReynolds. McReynolds refused to ride in an elevator with Brandeis, and he did not. He attended Justice Cardozo's swearing in, but he held up a newspaper in front of his head while the swearing in was happening. He was a virulent anti-Semite and on the court. And also there were 3 memorial services. When Cardozo died, he didn't go to one of them. The guy was a real jerk. He hated Brandeis, he hated Cardozo, he pretty much hated all Jews. But the only controversy with Cardozo's appointment is the fact that there will now be 2 Jews on the Supreme Court. And also that there would be 3 justices from New York State. There needed to be some geographic balance. However, Cardozo's qualifications were so outstanding that he was appointed, and he was the successor for Oliver Wendell Holmes. So in a sense, there was pressure to appoint a really distinguished judge because he was following a very distinguished judge. So that was part of why he was appointed. It was unanimous in the Judiciary Committee, and he didn't. There wasn't even a debate or roll call vote. It was unanimous consent in the Senate for his confirmation. Very different from Brandeis. Yeah, Marilyn?
Yeah, just a little aside, when Hoover was running, he was running against a gentleman named Al Smith. And Cardozo supported Al Smith.
That's right.
At Hoover. And so 4 years later, when Hoover wants him to be elected onto the Supreme Court, that really is very telling, because that was a clash 4 years prior. So it shows how competent he had to have been for Hoover to overlook the fact that he wasn't supported by him.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to Hoover's personality.
Right.
You know, that he was willing to make an appointment that was not to his political advantage. And that you know, whatever we say about Herbert Hoover, that is one of his great achievements, is he, you know, made a very wise Supreme Court appointment without regard for politics, which is remarkable. Certainly don't see that anymore today, obviously. So different time. Now, what about Cardozo's sort of jurisprudence? So interestingly, oftentimes he and Brandeis, so Cardozo is a justice at a very monumental time. You know, when President Roosevelt comes to office, you know, you have the New Deal, and you have all of these bills passed which are constitutionally questionable. You know, that really, you know, Social Security is one of them. You know, that is, there are justices who believe it is an unconstitutional thing. I don't quite understand why, but this is what it is. Cardozo wrote the opinion in the 5-4 decision permitting Social Security. So that was a very important decision. Now, where is that? I'll find that. However, many of Roosevelt's laws were struck down by the Supreme Court. We know this. I mean, the national, I think it's the National Industrial Relations Act struck down. Cardozo actually is in the majority on that. He helped strike it down. But many other laws, Cardozo and Brandeis and one other justice are in the minority, in that they support the president and the Congress's legitimacy in passing laws. So this is that argument about judicial activism, which we obviously still have today. And the question is, what is the role of the Supreme Court? What is the role of the Supreme Court? This is a classic. Is the role of the Supreme Court to strike down laws that they deem unconstitutional? Well, yes, of course, that's partly the role of the Supreme Court. However, what latitude do they grant in certain cases where it's unclear whether something violates the Supreme Court or not? Do you generally tend towards trusting the elected bodies of the United States, like Congress, like the president, in giving them latitude to pass laws that, you know, maybe it's unclear one way or the other, but do you give them essentially discretion because they are elected by the people? Or do you stick to, if it's clear it doesn't meet the Constitution, it's done? So the people who are more likely to strike down laws are said to be judicial activists, which is, this is kind of, well, each political side uses the terminology differently. So if you're on the left, you would say judicial activists are people who would strike down like gun control laws in New York, or who would decide in Roe versus Wade to end, you know, state laws. So that would be the left's critique of judicial activism. If you're on the right, you would say judicial activism is like the Warren Court, you know, permitting you know, Roe versus Wade to stand and superseding, you know, state law. So each side uses judicial activism as a charge against the other. You know, so today I don't think the term has any real meaning, but back then its meaning was, especially during the Roosevelt administration, if you would defer to Congress to pass laws that, unless it was clearly unconstitutional, if you let Congress pass laws that had some reasonable benefit and support, you were anti-judicial activists, essentially. And that Brandeis was that way, and Cardozo was that way. Generally, if Congress passed a law, they would say, unless it is clearly unconstitutional, we support it. So Social Security falls in that, and other laws of the New Deal fell in that. Okay. Also, he opposed court packing. Roosevelt wanted to pack when the Supreme Court was striking down Roosevelt's laws. That's when Roosevelt famously said, well, I'll just add a few more Supreme Court justices. Cardozo opposed that. His most important decision from a legal perspective was a case, interestingly, it was a case that took place in Connecticut. And this case was a man murdered somebody, and the state charged him with first-degree murder. But the judge threw out a piece of evidence, so then he was only convicted of second-degree murder. And the state of Connecticut appealed that. And the appeals court sent it back to the trial. The appeals court in Connecticut said, yeah, that's okay. He should be retried. And then somehow from the Connecticut court for his retrial, he appealed. I don't know how it came to the Supreme Court, but he went to the Supreme Court and said, hey, I've already been tried for this crime. This is double jeopardy. On a federal level, you can't be tried for the same crime twice if there's already been a conviction. And so does this federal idea apply to the states too? And Cardozo wrote the majority opinion saying it does not. That essentially the state can retry somebody if it deems, if the state legislature, if it's legal in that state can do that, even if it's not legal federally. So in some ways, it is a pro-federalist decision. So if you want to see contemporary relevance, you could say, well, if New York State passes certain gun control laws, if it's legal, if it's legal in New York State, and it doesn't absolutely violate the Constitution, we're going to let it stand, even if the same law would violate federal law. So it was kind of it was an influential decision in that it kind of limited the applicability of federal law or to states. Let me see what else. He had a couple of other, other opinions. Let me see where there was another interesting, here we go. It was Cardozo who lucidly and carefully spoke for the court in 1937 in upholding the key provisions of the landmark Social Security Act of 1935. Of these rulings, quote, one sustained the unemployment insurance provisions of the act and the other the old age pension. So there were other justices who believed that was unconstitutional. This is interesting. For his part, Judge Richard Posner, of course, Chicagoan, I believe he also taught at University of Chicago Law School. In fact, I was talking with a congregant a couple of years ago, and I saw him in a restaurant downtown. He had just come from Judge Posner's court, and he said it was really hard. It's a rigorous judge. So Judge Posner has suggested that Cardozo's judicial legacy might have been even greater had he, during his final 6 years, continued to serve as chief judges in New York Court of Appeals. Interesting, rather than on the Supreme Court. Although his high court may have conferred a slight halo effect, notes Posner, 6 more years on the New York Court of Appeals might have raised Cardozo's reputation to an even higher level than it has attained, as with Learned Hand and Henry Friendly, people who would be saying what a shame it was that Cardozo was never appointed to the Supreme Court and what a super job he would have done if he had been. He did well on the court, but his performance was anticlimax. In other words, his decisions on the New York Court of Appeals may have been even more important than on the Supreme Court. And that partly may have been because, as I sort of alluded to earlier, he was not happy on the Supreme Court. Part of it was he was alone in Washington, D.C. His whole family, his whole social circle was all in New York. That was where he lived. That was his home, and he wasn't married. So obviously his social circle was important. None of that, he didn't have any of that in Washington, D.C. Secondly, he wrote about how when he was on the New York Court of Appeals, it was a very collegial atmosphere. You know, judges would have dinner together, they would schmooze together, talk politics. On the Supreme Court, it was everyone did their own thing. They would get together occasionally to review decisions, but it was very cold and very formal and not collegial in the way that the Court of Appeals was. And so he was unhappy. And then he got sick. He had already had some sickness before. So he wasn't in great health even when he was appointed. But he had a lot of health issues really from the time he got to Washington, D.C. So the point is, he may have been, had he just stayed on the New York Court of Appeals and maybe he would have lived longer. He just didn't thrive on the Supreme Court, even though he had some major appointments. Interestingly, he remained a member of the Spanish Portuguese synagogue his whole life. He was really, Brandeis didn't ever belong to a synagogue. Frankfurter, who succeeds Cardozo, Frankfurter grew up going to a synagogue, but he didn't affiliate later. Cardozo remains, and he had an Orthodox funeral service. Although Stephen Wise was also there, the Rabbi Stephen Wise, the Reform rabbi, Cardozo kind of maintained his Orthodox, even though he was sort of non-practicing Orthodox Jew. Interestingly, also, that this is fascinating. I didn't know this until I researched this. The way the Spanish Portuguese synagogue worked, they have a board, but they also have a hereditary board. So these are the people whose families have been there for generations. And this hereditary board is a little bit even more powerful than the elected board. And so Cardozo was part of the hereditary board. And in 1925, there was a proposal to get rid of the separate seating for men and women, which, in the 20s and 30s, a lot of Orthodox synagogues had mixed seating. People don't know that today, but essentially Orthodoxy was pretty relaxed up until the 60s. The 60s is when all the, it's like the larger culture became more liberal and Orthodoxy became more conservative at that point. But in the 20s and 30s, there were many synagogues where there was mixed seating for men and women. And the Spanish Portuguese synagogue had a proposal to mix its seating. Cardozo gave a speech in which he opposed mixed seating because it was inconsistent with the tradition of our ancestors. And he was so persuasive that the measure was defeated on the hereditary board 18-1. And so there was no mixed seating. Even though one could say, well, who's this guy who never comes to synagogue who suddenly, is the one telling us all what to do? But that's what happened. So this is Cardozo. And perhaps his legacy, aside from being, an influential judge and justice, we have the Cardozo Law School, which is part of Yeshiva University. So this law school is named for him. And he really, he kind of was probably the most prominent Sephardic Jew in American Jewish history. If you think about it, Sephardic Jews, there are many. There aren't as many now as there once were, because I said, there's a lot of assimilation, but he kind of is sort of a prototypical exemplar of this heritage, which is a very interesting heritage and one that has really died away, but it's still quite an interesting story. Questions, comments, things you want to ask more about Cardozo. There's only one biography of him written. Unfortunately, he might have been gay. I researched this. There are several articles speculating that he had some intensely close male friendships. Not that there's but he had all. It's very difficult to construct a history because he had most of all he had Judge Irving Lehman, who was one of his friends, who was another prominent New York lawyer. He asked him to burn all his papers when he died, and he did. So there's very little record of his personal life. And he was very diffident in a sense. As I said, he socialized. He had, New York, but he had a certain kind of privacy, and which was not uncommon with people who, you couldn't really be, out, and I mean, you could be, but it wasn't really accepted as part of, an establishment society in that time. So there are several, sites that kind of claim him in that way, but there's really, you can't really say either way. It's virtually impossible. We just know he was a lifelong bachelor. Comments, questions? Any lingering concerns? Okay, so yeah, Marilyn, go ahead. Absolutely.
Just some trivia.
Mhm.
When he was asked to sign the American Zionist, the Zionists of America, actually, he wasn't really enthusiastic, it said, about it, but he did, because he thought, why should I sign against it when I can sign for it? So he did.
That's right. He lent his name to the American Zionist movement at the request of Stephen Wise. So it's interesting. Stephen Wise, who was, this very prominent political progressive and was close friends with Brandeis, was actually closer with Cardozo. Like their families would socialize together frequently. So he had a request from Stephen Wise to lend his name to the Zionist Organization of America, which he did. He was sort of, I would think about Cardozo and his Jewishness is, he was proud of being Jewish, obviously, of his lineage, but he was not, he kind of is sort of your classic sort of secular intellectual Jew who, believes that Orthodoxy is the legitimate Judaism, but he is devoted to the law. And there have been, there have been others like that, who are not observant, but who maintain a certain pride. And I think that that's sort of what Cardozo had. And yeah, I really enjoyed reading what he wrote. He was a remarkable writer, and he probably would have been an even more influential justice had he lived longer. It's sort of it's sad that he that he died so early. But another interesting part of his legacy is, like Brandeis, he started hiring Jewish law clerks, and many of those law clerks ended up becoming immensely influential, successful lawyers. Before Brandeis, none of the justices hired Jewish law clerks, but starting with Brandeis and then Cardozo and then Frankfurter, they added them. Yes, Evie. You're on mute. Yeah, unmute.
Yeah, we have, on that same wavelength, we have a friend who was an Iranian Jew, and she moved here just around the turnover of the Shah and so forth. But around that time, they had taken on Iranian names. Her kids were all educated here, very well educated. Her son went through Northwestern and then Johns Hopkins for law school. He did not get one interview after he graduated from law school for the longest time. When he changed his name back to his original name, all the doors opened up, and he's now a partner in one of the major law firms. So there's that whole reverse.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah. Most American Jews, again, like us, are Ashkenazic. Even German Jews who came over in the 1840s are considered Ashkenazic. If you're from Europe, generally from Central, Western, Eastern Europe, you're Ashkenazic. Sephardic are generally from Spain, Middle East, and they have a very different, it's a different history, much more generally assimilated to a degree, but not totally. With the Ashkenazic, it was either extreme assimilation or extreme standing out, like the ultra-Orthodox or Reform and assimilated. Sephardic, you could be assimilated in that, you might go to a soccer game on Shabbat, but you're still very Jewish and you're never going to try to be, so it was a different mode of adaptation. And that's still in some ways true today. So I will see all of you next week. We'll talk about Felix Frankfurter, another extraordinary Jewish Supreme Court justice. So see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Stacy.